Welcome to another deep dive. And when I say welcome, I am speaking directly to you, the ultimate learner.
Absolutely.
Whether you're gearing up for a historical debate or trying to untangle the complexities of the modern world by examining how we got here, or you're simply driven by this insatiable curiosity about the very messy reality of human history, you have found exactly the right place.
You really have.
We have a pretty profound mission today. We are going to completely bypass that neat, sanitized version of history we all get in school, right? And head straight into the heart of a moment that completely rewired the 20th century.
Yeah, it really did.
We're uncovering the incredibly complex, deeply chaotic, and frankly surprisingly tragic reality behind one of the most famous dates in human history.
That is exactly the goal today. We are pulling all of our insights, all the facts, the narrative threads from one incredibly comprehensive foundation, which is the Wikipedia article on the Armistice of 11 November 1918. And what makes this particular deep dive so compelling is how the historical record strips away all that simplified folklore. It doesn't just give us the famous date. It presents the raw, unfiltered, minute-by-minute sequence of events that actually brought the absolute meat grinder of the First World War to a halt.
Because everyone knows that famous phrase, right? The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month.
Oh, absolutely. It's iconic.
It is. It's burned into our collective memory. It sounds so perfectly neat.
Poetic, almost.
Yeah, exactly. Like poetic, resolved, like a curtain gracefully falling on a stage. But when you actually start looking at the historical record, the picture that emerges is anything but graceful.
Not even close.
The path to that exact minute on the clock was paved with secret train meetings in dark, rain-soaked forests. It had some of the most cynical political scapegoating imaginable.
Naval mutinies, too.
Right. Naval mutinies, full-scale revolutions, and just shocking numbers of casualties on a day that was ostensibly supposed to be entirely about peace. The massive gap between the poetry of that 11th hour and the grim, muddy reality on the ground is what we are digging into today.
It is a staggering gap.
Yeah.
But before we really get into the mechanics of how all of this unfolded, it is crucial that we pause for a second and lay down a very clear parameter for our discussion.
Good idea.
The history we are examining today delves heavily into the intense political maneuverings of the time. It discusses various political factions, including right-wing myths that emerged, the actions of socialists, the fears of communists, and the looming impact of the Bolsheviks.
It's a total political minefield.
Exactly. And because of this politically charged content, I want to make it explicitly clear to you, our listener, that this deep dive is not taking any political sides whatsoever. We are not endorsing, we are not validating or condemning the viewpoints of the historical factions we'll mention. Our sole objective is to impartially report on the historical facts, the sequence of events, and the ideas exactly as they are contained within our original source material. We are here to understand the history, not to litigate the politics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's transport ourselves back to the late summer and early autumn of 1918.
Let's do it.
We have to set the stage for why this armistice even happened in the first place. Because the German Empire didn't just wake up one day and decide to quit. We are looking at an empire that is fundamentally crumbling under its own weight.
Imploding, really.
Imploding. So I want to start with the military collapse. The historical record pinpoints the beginning of the end to August 1918, specifically the Battle of Amiens.
Yes, the Black Day.
Right, but help me understand this, because earlier that same year, in the spring, Germany had launched this massive offensive. They had gained all this ground. What changed so drastically by August?
Well, what changed was the absolute exhaustion of the German military machine, and that was colliding with fresh Allied tactics and resources.
Okay.
The Battle of Amiens in August is often referred to as the Black Day of the German army. During the spring offensive, the Germans had pushed incredibly hard. Throwing everything they had into breaking the trench deadlock before the Americans could arrive in large numbers.
So it was a race against time for them.
Exactly. They gained territory, yes, but they lost their best, most experienced stormtroopers in the process. They basically bled themselves dry to take ground that was ultimately impossible to defend.
So they stretched themselves too thin.
Way too thin. So when the Allies counterattacked at Amiens, utilizing coordinated tank warfare, aircraft, and creeping artillery barrages in a way the Germans hadn't fully anticipated.
The German lines just shattered.
Completely.
Yeah.
They were forced into a massive withdrawal, falling all the way back to the Hindenburg line.
So they essentially lost every single inch in ground they had just sacrificed hundreds of thousands of men to take.
Every inch.
The psychological blow of that alone must have been devastating. But it didn't stop there, right? Because immediately after this, we see the Allies launch what's known as the 100 Days Offensive.
Right, and this wasn't just a series of isolated attacks. It was a giant, coordinated pincer movement.
Like a vice.
Exactly like a vice. If you picture a map of the Western Front in late September 1918, you have a massive combined force of United States and French troops attacking the Meuse-Argonne region.
Okay, so that's in the south.
That is the southern jaw of the pincer. Hundreds of thousands of fresh American troops who hadn't been ground down by 4 years of trench warfare are pushing relentlessly.
And what's happening in the north?
Simultaneously to the north, you have the British and Dominion forces assaulting the St. Quentin Canal. This is the northern jaw. And they actually broke through the Hindenburg Line, which the Germans had considered practically impregnable.
So the German army is suddenly facing an overwhelming, synchronized crush from two directions.
Yeah, the tactical situation was rapidly becoming completely untenable.
I'm trying to visualize this. You've got an exhausted German army, completely overstretched, and suddenly they are caught in this giant vice. But it wasn't just the Western Front that was collapsing.
No, not at all.
When you look at the broader map, the dominant effect happening to Germany's allies is almost unbelievable. It's like watching a geopolitical house of cards disintegrate in real time.
That's a great way to put it.
First, you have the Ottoman Empire, which is basically described as being close to total exhaustion. Then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is literally descending into absolute chaos, fracturing along ethnic lines.
Internal collapse.
But the one that really caught my eye was Bulgaria. The Bulgarian army's resistance on the Macedonian front completely collapsed, leading to the Armistice of Salonika on September 29th. Why was Bulgaria such a critical linchpin?
We really need to pause on that detail about Bulgaria because the strategic implications are massive.
Okay.
For most of the war, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, and Bulgaria formed a contiguous bloc. They were connected.
Right.
But the collapse of Bulgaria, combined with an Italian victory over the Austro-Hungarians around the same time, completely changed the strategic map. It effectively severed the Central Powers in half.
Oh, wow.
But more terrifyingly for Berlin, it opened a back door for the Allies to invade Germany from the south, right through an entirely collapsing Austria.
Wait, so Germany had spent 4 agonizing years fighting a two-front war against France and Britain in the west and Russia in the east.
Yes.
And just as they finally get Russia out of the war in 1917, suddenly there's a threat of an invasion from the south.
Exactly. They're facing the terrifying prospect of a third front opening up on their completely exposed southern border. The German high command recognized immediately that this was a fatal development. They had absolutely zero reserves left to send south to defend Bavaria.
Which brings us to the situation inside Germany itself, the home front.
Yeah, the home front was a nightmare.
Because while the military is facing this giant pincer in France and a new southern backdoor through Austria, the civilian population is enduring absolute hell. The naval blockade by the Allies seems to have been incredibly effective, but brutally so. I've heard the term turnip winter thrown around regarding Germany during this time.
Right.
Just how bad were the conditions for the average civilian?
The conditions were catastrophic. The Allied naval blockade had effectively choked off Germany's ability to import food and essential fertilizers for years.
Years.
Yes. The turnip winter actually refers to the winter of 1916 to 1917, where the potato crop failed, and the civilian population had to survive almost entirely on rutabagas, which were previously just used as animal feed.
That sounds awful.
It was. And by the autumn of 1918, things were even worse. The German people were surviving on literal starvation rations. Bread was adulterated with sawdust to make it go further. Meat was practically non-existent. You have a population that has been slowly starving for years.
And if starvation wasn't enough, you have the devastating Spanish flu pandemic sweeping through this incredibly vulnerable population.
Precisely. The influenza virus was tearing through cities, killing people who were already immunocompromised by years of severe malnutrition.
It's just a perfect storm of misery.
It really is. And that civilian suffering directly impacted the military's capacity to continue the war. While the discipline of the German troops actually on the front line was miraculously holding together, there was a desperate, critical shortage of manpower.
Because they just didn't have anyone left to draft.
Right. Between the horrific battlefield casualties of the 100 Days Offensive, the starvation rations making men physically too weak to fight, and the toll of the Spanish flu, which incapacitated up to 1 million soldiers, they simply didn't have the bodies to fill the trenches.
So they try to pull new recruits from the home front, but what kind of recruits are they getting?
They're getting teenagers and old men, and worse for the military command, these new recruits are arriving completely war-weary, entirely disaffected, and carrying all the misery, anti-war sentiment, and revolutionary discontent of the starving civilian population right into the frontline trenches.
The military machine was running on fumes, and the engine was starting to spark. So the military is essentially paralyzed, and the civilians are starving. I have to imagine the pressure cooker at the highest levels of German command is about to explode.
It does explode.
And this brings us to the political chessboard, the sheer panic at the top. We are at the Imperial Army headquarters at Spa in occupied Belgium. The date is September 29th, 1918.
Same day Bulgaria signs their armistice.
Right. So Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, who, along with Hindenburg, is basically running a military dictatorship in Germany at this point, goes to Emperor Wilhelm II and the Imperial Chancellor. And Ludendorff just drops a bomb.
A massive one.
He tells them the military situation is completely hopeless. He explicitly says he cannot guarantee that the front will hold for another 2 hours. 2 hours. And he demands that a request be sent for an immediate ceasefire.
The panic is palpable. Ludendorff's nerves are famously shattered at this point.
But what's truly sinister is the strategic pivot he makes in that exact same breath. He doesn't just ask for a ceasefire. He recommends that the German government fundamentally change its structure. He demands they accept the main demands of US President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which specifically included putting the imperial government on a democratic footing.
Now, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Ludendorff was a hardline, aristocratic, authoritarian military commander. Why on earth would he suddenly advocate for handing power over to a democratic parliament? That makes no sense.
It makes perfect cynical sense when you realize what he was doing.
Oh, I see where you're going.
The historical record makes his motive chillingly clear. Yes, he did it, hoping for more favorable peace terms from the Americans, believing Wilson would be softer on a fellow democracy than on an autocratic empire.
Sure, that's the surface reason.
But primarily, he did it to save the face of the Imperial German army. Ludendorff knew the war was lost. He knew a humiliating surrender was inevitable. By handing power to a civilian democratic government at the exact moment the war was lost, he ensured the new democratic politicians would be the ones forced to sign the capitulation. This is one of the most critical moments we are going to talk about today. Ludendorff is orchestrating a military defeat, recognizing the army has failed, but intentionally designing the political aftermath so the civilians take the fall.
That is dark.
There is a specific quote that we have to feature here. Ludendorff, speaking to the officers of his staff on October 1st about these civilian politicians taking over, says, "They now must lie on the bed that they've made for us."
The sheer audacity of that statement.
I know.
It is breathtakingly cynical. He is preemptively washing his hands of the disaster he helped create. This exact moment, this specific, calculated decision by Ludendorff to step back into the shadows and let a brand new civilian government sign the surrender is the absolute bedrock of the disastrous stab-in-the-back myth that will plague Germany later.
Yeah.
He is setting the trap.
And the political scrambling just accelerates from there. On October 3rd, the liberal Prince Maximilian of Baden is appointed as the new chancellor, replacing the old Ferd specifically to negotiate this armistice. By October 5th, they are sending messages to President Wilson in Washington. But this telegraph war in October is fascinating because Wilson is playing absolute hardball. The Germans want peace based on his 14 points, but Wilson keeps escalating his demands.
We should probably clarify what Wilson's 14 points actually were because they are central to this whole negotiation.
Yeah, good point.
In January 1918, Wilson had outlined a vision for a post-war world. It included things like open diplomacy with no secret treaties, absolute freedom of navigation on the seas, the removal of economic barriers, and free trade.
Sounds very modern.
It was. It also included national self-determination for the peoples of Europe and the creation of a general association of nations, what would eventually become the League of Nations. It was a highly idealistic, almost utopian framework for peace without a clear victor or vanquished.
Right, so the Germans, facing total military collapse, suddenly say, hey, those 14 points sound great, let's do that. But Wilson isn't buying this sudden conversion to democracy. On October 23rd, Wilson essentially writes back that if the U.S. has to deal with the military masters and the monarchical autocrats of Germany, they aren't going to negotiate peace. They are going to demand absolute surrender.
He draws a hard line.
He really does. He makes the abdication of the Kaiser a hard prerequisite for even stopping the shooting.
And while Wilson is demanding the Kaiser's head and pushing his idealistic points, there is a massive fracture happening among the Allies themselves.
Oh.
Because the French, the British, and the Italians didn't actually want Wilson's 14 points.
Really? Why not?
Yeah.
Wasn't the whole point of the Allied effort to establish a lasting peace?
You get to look at it from the European perspective. The European allies viewed these 14 commandments, as French Prime Minister Clemenceau mockingly called them, essentially as clever American propaganda. Yeah. It was a great psychological weapon for undermining the fighting spirit of the Central Powers, but they thought the actual principles were vague, completely unrealistic, and deeply threatening to their own post-war plans.
Threatening how?
Well, France and Britain had vast colonial empires. They didn't want to hear about national self-determination.
Oh, right. That would be bad for the empire business.
Exactly. Furthermore, France had had its industrial heartland completely destroyed by 4 years of German occupation and artillery. They didn't want a lenient peace based on American ideals. They wanted security. They wanted to crush Germany's physical ability to ever cross the Rhine River again.
This disagreement among the Allies gets so intense that Wilson has to consult the top military commanders to find a consensus on what the actual armistice terms should be.
Right.
And the debate between these Allied commanders is so revealing of their vastly different mindsets. You have Field Marshal Douglas Haig representing the British. He actually urges moderation, which surprised me.
Yes. Haig argued that the German army wasn't totally broken yet. He believed they could still retreat to shorter, highly defensible lines closer to the German border and drag the war out for another year.
Which nobody wanted.
Right. He wanted to grant them conditions they could actually stomach to end the slaughter now. But interestingly, there was also a political calculation. The British establishment wanted to keep the German army somewhat intact and mobilized to act as a conservative counterweight against the spread of communist agitation sweeping westward from Bolshevik Russia.
Oh, that makes sense. They're already looking at the next threat.
Exactly.
But the French commander, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, had a totally different view, right?
Completely different. Foch agrees with Haig's military assessment that the Germans could retreat and form a new defensive line. But his conclusion is the exact opposite.
He wants to crush them.
Foch wants stringent, punishing terms. He doesn't want to negotiate. He wants to dictate. He demands the military occupation of the Rhineland, Allied bridgeheads over the Rhine River itself, and the surrender of massive, crippling quantities of military material. He wants to physically neuter the German military once and for all.
And then finally, you have General John Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces. I have to play devil's advocate here because Pershing's stance sounds incredibly extreme.
It was very extreme.
He opposed giving the Germans any armistice at all. He wanted to reject the ceasefire entirely and fight the war all the way to Berlin. Why would he want to continue the bloodshed when the enemy is asking for peace?
You can certainly view it as warmongering, but Pershing actually foresaw exactly what would happen if they didn't secure an unconditional surrender on German soil.
What did he see coming?
He believed that if the Allied armies didn't march into Berlin, the German military would never truly admit defeat, and the German populace wouldn't believe they were beaten. He wrote that accepting an armistice now would only mean they would have to fight Germany again in another 20 years.
Wow, that is a chillingly accurate prophecy.
It really is. But the combined effect of these hardcore military perspectives from Foch and Pershing effectively nullified Wilson's idealistic 14 points. The terms were going to be brutal.
And while the Allied commanders are arguing in Paris over exactly how hard to crush Germany, Germany is rapidly crushing itself from the inside.
Yes.
The situation completely spirals out of the government's control. We see the outbreak of the German Revolution, and it starts, of all places, with the Navy.
Yes. It starts with the mutiny of the German High Seas Fleet. For most of the war, the mighty German fleet had been bottled up in port by the British Royal Navy.
Just sitting there.
Sitting there.
Yeah.
In late October, the German Naval Command, without authorization from the new civilian government, decided to launch one final, massive, suicidal battle against the British fleet to, quote, save the honor of the Navy.
So they ordered these sailors, who knew the war was basically over and the government was suing for peace, to sail out and die just for the sake of naval pride.
Exactly. And the sailors simply refused.
I don't blame them.
Right. During the night of October 29th to 30th, sailors in the port of Wilhelmshaven revolt. They extinguish the boilers on their ships. They refuse to weigh anchor. And when the naval command tries to suppress them and arrest the ringleaders, this mutiny just erupts and spreads like wildfire.
It jumps from the ships to the straits.
Within days, the revolt moves from the ports into the industrial cities. Workers' and soldiers' councils, modeled directly on the Soviets of the Russian Revolution, start seizing control in major cities like Kiel, Bremen, Munich, and eventually Berlin.
What do they want?
Their primary goal is an immediate end to the war, the abdication of the Kaiser, and drastic social reform. The pressure on the government is insurmountable.
The situation forces the hand of the ruling elite. Prince Max of Baden, the chancellor, realizes that the Kaiser's stubborn refusal to abdicate is not only blocking any chance of peace with the Allies, but it is fueling a full-blown, violent, potentially communist revolution right outside his window in Berlin.
Yeah, he has to act fast.
So, on November 9th, acting entirely on his own authority without even telling the Kaiser, Prince Max announces to the press that Wilhelm II has abdicated. He then hands the office of Chancellor over to Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the Social Democrats.
And that very same afternoon, another Social Democrat, Philipp Scheidemann, steps onto a balcony at the Reichstag.
Okay.
He sees massive crowds of workers and soldiers, and to preempt the more radical communists from declaring a Soviet republic, he officially declares Germany a republic.
Just like that.
Just like that. So, in the span of a few chaotic hours, the centuries-old German Empire falls, the Kaiser is forced to flee by train into exile in the Netherlands, and this brand new, incredibly fragile democratic republic is born.
And it is born just in time to be handed the pen to sign a humiliating, crushing surrender, exactly as Ludendorff had planned.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the actual signing process. Section 3, the secret train in Compiègne. The negotiations, if you can even call them that.
Dictations, more like?
Yeah. We have Matthias Erzberger stepping up to lead the German delegation. Who is Erzberger and why is he the one going instead of a military general?
Matthias Erzberger was a prominent civilian politician from the Catholic Center Party. He had actually been an early supporter of the war, but by 1917 he had become a leading voice in the Reichstag, pushing for a negotiated peace.
So he's already associated with wanting peace.
Right. And because the military high command, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, refused to have their fingerprints anywhere near the surrender document, they forced the new civilian government to send someone. Erzberger was essentially handed a poison chalice.
What a terrible position to be in.
He was a civilian, a Democrat, being sent to surrender on behalf of an army that claimed it hadn't been defeated.
Imagine the journey this man had to take. Erzberger and his small team crossed the front line in 5 cars. They are escorted by French officers for 10 harrowing hours across the completely devastated war zone of northern France.
It's just a horrific landscape.
10 hours driving over filled-in artillery craters, navigating through seas of mud, passing the rotting corpses of horses, and seeing the total ruins of towns wiped off the map by 4 years of industrialized slaughter.
Yeah.
They cross no man's land with a white flag and a bugler sounding the ceasefire, just to reach the meeting point on the morning of November 8th.
What's fascinating here is the sheer psychological dominance of the setup once they finally arrive.
The power dynamics.
Exactly. They aren't taken to a grand palace or a government building in Paris. They are taken to a secret destination, a railway siding deep in the forest of Compiègne. And they are brought aboard the private train car of the Allied Supreme Commander, Marshal Ferdinand Foch.
The claustrophobia of that must have been intense. You're trapped in a train car in a dark forest with a man who has just defeated your nation.
And this wasn't a diplomatic negotiation around a table. Foch designed it to be a dictation. He treated the German delegation with absolute icy contempt.
I can imagine.
The historical record explicitly notes that Foch only appeared twice during the entire 3 days of talks.
Only twice in 3 days.
Yes. He appeared on the first day simply to ask the German delegation, "What do you want of me?" When Erzberger said they were there to hear the proposals for an armistice, Foch coldly replied, "I have no proposals to make."
Wow.
He forced the Germans to formally ask for an armistice as a defeated power. Then he handed them a staggering list of Allied demands and essentially told them they had 72 hours to agree. Take it or leave it.
So they have 72 hours. Erzberger is stuck in this train car, frantically sending telegraphs back to a government in Berlin that is literally in the middle of a revolution.
trying to talk to leaders who might not even be in power the next hour.
Right. He is begging for instructions, but his leverage is exactly zero. They were allowed to discuss the technical terms with other French and Allied officers, but not with Foch himself.
Right. The Germans were trapped. They were only able to correct a few demands that were physically impossible to fulfill.
Like what?
For example, they pointed out the Allies were demanding the surrender of more operational submarines than the entire German fleet actually possessed.
Okay, yeah, you can't hand over what doesn't exist.
Exactly. They also managed to slightly extend the timeline for their military withdrawal across the Rhine, arguing that if they had to move that fast, their army would simply disintegrate into an armed, starving mob. But otherwise, the terms were immovable.
On Sunday, November 10th, the French show Erzberger Paris newspapers confirming that his own Kaiser had abdicated.
He finds out from the enemy's newspapers.
Yeah. That same day, Ebert, the new chancellor in Berlin, finally gets a message through instructing Erzberger to sign. They even got a message from Paul von Hindenburg, the head of the German High Command, begging them to sign even if the terms couldn't be improved because the army was on the verge of total collapse.
Because the terms Foch handed them were absolutely crushing.
Yeah.
When we look at the specific list of surrendered material, it's not just a military disarmament. It is a systematic, calculated dismantling of a modern industrial state's capacity to function.
Let's hear the numbers.
The Allies demanded 5,000 artillery pieces, 25,000 machine guns, 3,000 trench mortars, and 1,700 aircraft, specifically including all-night bombers. That immediately strips away their offensive capability.
But then you look at the logistical demands, and my jaw hit the floor.
Yeah.
5,000 railway locomotives, 150,000 railway carriages, and 5,000 motorized road trucks. The numbers are so vast they are almost hard to visualize. Just to put that in perspective, taking 150,000 railway carriages isn't just taking their guns.
Precisely. It is essential to understand why those specific items mattered so much. In 1918, a nation's entire existence was dependent on railways. Taking 150,000 carriages and 5,000 locomotives was about completely paralyzing Germany's internal logistics.
So they can't move troops.
Yes, it meant they couldn't move troops to the border to restart the war, but it also meant they would severely struggle to move food from the farms to the starting cities or coal from the mines to heat homes during the winter. It was a strategic crippling of the civilian economy to ensure absolute compliance.
And furthermore, the terms required the evacuation of all German territory on the west side of the Rhine River and established major Allied bridgeheads with a 30-kilometer radius on the east side at key industrial cities, Mainz, Koblenz, and Cologne. They were putting Allied boots firmly on German soil, holding the industrial heartland hostage.
And on top of all that, the Allies demanded the immediate release of all Allied prisoners of war.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this is a deeply brutal punitive detail. This was without any reciprocal release of German POWs.
Wait, really?
The German prisoners stayed locked up in Allied camps. Furthermore, the naval blockade of Germany, the very blockade causing the starvation rations, the sawdust bread, the turnip winter we talked about earlier, was to continue in full force until a final permanent peace treaty was agreed upon months later at Versailles.
So the starving continues.
It was an armistice of total, unmitigated submission.
Which brings us to the signing itself, and into Section 4, the 11th hour and the deeply tragic final morning of the war.
The agreement was officially signed in Fachy's railway car at 5 a.m. Paris time on Monday, November 11th, 1918. However, it was scheduled to come into effect 6 hours later at 11 a.m.
Why the 6-hour delay? If the ink is dry at 5 a.m., why not just issue an immediate ceasefire order?
The delay was ostensibly practical. They needed time to transmit the news down a vast, complex chain of command, from the Supreme Headquarters through the army groups, down to the divisions, brigades, and finally to the millions of individual men sitting in the mud across hundreds of miles of the Western Front.
Because communications back then were pretty rudimentary.
Very. They relied on a spotty network of telegraphs, field telephones, and literally just runners. But those 6 hours of delay proved to be lethal.
Here's where it gets really interesting, but in the most heartbreaking, infuriating way possible. Because you would think, once the paper is signed, the shooting naturally winds down. But the historical record reveals that the fighting actually intensified in some sectors right up until 11 a.m.
It's awful.
The numbers are just unbelievable. There were nearly 11,000 casualties, 10,944 to be exact, on the very last day of the war. Of those, 2,738 men actually died. Nearly 3,000 men killed in a war that was already officially over on paper. How on earth does a military apparatus justify that?
It is justified through a mix of bureaucratic inertia, logistical stubbornness, and cold, hard, callous military calculation.
Logistical stubbornness, what do you mean?
Well, you have to remember, these generals have been fighting a war of attrition for 4 years. The mindset doesn't just switch off. Many artillery units continued to fire simply because they didn't want to have to haul their heavy spare ammunition all the way back to the railheads.
You have got to be kidding me.
So they just fired it off at German targets.
They killed people, rather than carry heavy boxes.
Essentially, yes. Furthermore, Allied commanders wished to ensure that if the armistice failed, if the Germans rejected the terms at the last minute or resumed fighting in a week, the Allied armies would be in the most favorable tactical positions possible.
So they ordered their men to keep advancing.
Keep capturing high ground, keep attacking machine gun nests right up to the final minute. A stunning example of this determination to maintain pressure is Battery 4 of the U.S. Navy's long-range 14-inch railway guns.
What did they do?
They fired their last massive shell at exactly 10.57 and 30 seconds in the morning from the Verdun area. They timed it perfectly, calculating the flight time so the shell would land far behind the German front lines, just seconds before the 11 a.m. deadline.
It is so clinical and so utterly devastating when you realize what that meant for the men on the ground. We have the names and stories of some of the final fallen, and slowing down to look at these stories is really the only way to grasp the senselessness of those final hours. For instance, there's George Edwin Ellison, a soldier from the UK serving with the 5th Royal Irish Lancers.
Yes.
He had survived 4 solid years of the war. He fought at the First Battle of Mons in 1914, and he was killed around 9:30 a.m. that morning while scouting on the outskirts of that exact same city, Mons, in Belgium, an hour and a half before peace.
Then there is Augustin Trebuchet, the last French soldier to die. His story is incredibly poignant and highlights the mundane tragedies of the front line.
Tell me about him.
He was shot at 10:45 a.m. He wasn't even engaged in an active firefight at that exact moment. He was acting as a messenger.
What was the message?
He was running to tell his fellow soldiers who were preparing for a completely unnecessary assault across the Meuse River that hot soup would be served to them after the ceasefire at 11:30.
Oh, man.
He died 15 minutes before the gun stopped, carrying a message about soup.
At that exact same time, 10:45 a.m., Marcel Toussaint-Touffe, the last Belgian soldier to die, succumbed to a mortal lung wound from German machine gun fire.
And the timeline gets even tighter, almost to the second.
We have George Lawrence Price, a private from Canada. He was part of a force advancing into a Belgian town north of Mons. They were clearing houses. He was shot and killed by a German sniper at 10:58 a.m., just 2 minutes before the armistice went into effect. 2 minutes.
And then generally recognized as the last American and the last soldier killed in action overall on the Western Front is Henry Gunther. His story is just soaked in tragic psychological irony.
What happened to Gunther?
Gunther had recently been demoted in rank because military censors caught him writing a letter home, complaining about the miserable conditions. He was apparently deeply despondent over this demotion.
He wanted to prove himself.
Exactly. In a desperate, reckless attempt to redeem his reputation in the final minutes of the war, he charged a German roadblock with his bayonet fixed.
The war is practically over.
The historical accounts note that the German troops were astonished. They knew the armistice was literally seconds away. They actually tried to wave him off, firing warning shots, but he kept charging and firing his rifle at them.
You wouldn't stop.
He was killed by a burst of machine gun fire exactly 60 seconds before 11 a.m.
It's just a cascade of totally avoidable heartbreak. And the tragedy wasn't confined to the Allied side.
No. We have records of the last German to die in the war, believed to be a lieutenant named Thomas. Shortly after 11 a.m., perhaps 11:01 a.m., after the ceasefire had officially begun and the artillery had finally gone quiet, he exited his trench.
He thought it was safe.
He began walking across no man's land, presumably to inform the American troops opposite him that the armistice was in effect and that the Germans would be evacuating their positions.
Oh, no.
But the specific unit of Americans he approached hadn't yet received the news through their chain of command. They saw an enemy soldier approaching their line, opened fire, and killed him instantly.
It's maddening. And it wasn't ignored by history. There must have been immense backlash once the public realized nearly 3,000 men died on the morning of peace.
There was a deep, profound shame that followed. In the United States, Congress actually opened a formal investigation post-war to find out why this happened and to see if blame should be placed on the leaders of the American Expeditionary Forces, including General Pershing.
good.
They demanded to know why American boys were ordered to charge machine guns at 10:30 a.m. for ground they could have just walked onto at 11:01 a.m.
Did Pershing face any consequences?
No formal punishment. He defended his actions by saying he was maintaining pressure on a retreating enemy.
Typical military defense.
But in France, the shame was so acute and the political optics so horrifying that the military authorities literally engaged in a cover-up.
A cover-up.
The graves of many French soldiers who died on November 11th were backdated to November 10th. The government couldn't bear the public or the grieving mothers seeing that men were ordered to their deaths on the very day of peace.
This profound disconnect between the high-level signatures in a comfortable train car and the brutal, senseless reality in the mud leads us perfectly into Section 5, the aftermath and the birth of a dangerous myth.
Because the reactions to the 11 a.m. ceasefire were completely bifurcated depending on where you were standing.
Very true. If you look at the home front for the Allies, the reaction was explosive. The news officially hit Paris around 9 a.m. By 11 a.m., the first peace gunshot was fired from Fort Montlhéry.
The Eiffel Tower fired shots.
The Ministry of War and the Élysée Palace threw up flags, church bells rang all across Paris. The French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, appeared on a balcony and shouted, "Vive la France!" to a massive cheering crowd.
And in London, Big Ben shined for the first time in years. People flooded Trafalgar Square. It was pure jubilation and relief.
But at the actual front lines, the reaction was incredibly muted. There was no cheering. Yeah. The surviving soldiers describe a sudden, deafening silence that was almost unnerving after 4 years of constant artillery roar. There's a quote from a British corporal who described the exact moment at 11 a.m. He said, "The Germans came from their trenches, bowed to us, and then went away." That was it. There was nothing with which we could celebrate except cookies.
Just eating dry cookies and feeling a profound sense of emptiness after 52 exhausting months of violence.
That silence and the specific way the war ended on the battlefield became the incubator for one of the most toxic, destructive lies of the 20th century. So what does this all mean?
What's fascinating here is that we have to look at the geographical reality of November 11th, 1918. At the exact moment the armistice took effect, the Western Front was still some 450 miles over 700 kilometers away from Berlin.
That is a huge distance.
The Kaiser's armies had retreated for the battlefields of France and Belgium, yes. But they had retreated in relatively good order. They marched back to Germany with their rifles on their shoulders. Most importantly, the German frontier had barely been breached. Essentially, no Allied troops had invaded or occupied German soil before the fighting stopped.
Right. It means that to the average German civilian at home, the army didn't physically look defeated.
They hadn't seen enemy soldiers marching triumphantly through the Brandenburg Gate. They hadn't seen their cities shelled into rubble like the towns in France and Belgium.
And this physical reality, this lack of visible, visceral defeat, allowed Hindenburg, Ludendorff, and other senior right-wing leaders to spread a massive, self-serving lie.
They pushed what became known as the stab-in-the-back myth.
They claimed that the mighty, undefeated German army was never actually beaten on the battlefield. Instead, they argued the army was betrayed, stabbed in the back by the public at home who failed their patriotic calling, and specifically sabotaged by democratic politicians, Jews, socialists, and Bolsheviks who instigated the November Revolution.
It's just a masterclass in shifting the blame. Ludendorff designed the civilian handover at Spa exactly for this purpose.
But how did they convince the public of this? Didn't people know they were losing?
The military had heavily censored the press throughout the war, so the public had been fed a diet of constant victories until the very end. The shock of the sudden surrender made them desperate for an explanation that didn't involve military failure.
People want to believe what feels good.
And the military leaders even used foreign press to bolster their lie. They grossly misrepresented a book by British Major General Frederick Maurice called The Last 4 Months.
What did they do?
Hindenburg literally went before a National Assembly committee a year later, in November 1919, and declared under oath, quote, "As an English general has very truly said, the German army was stabbed in the back." He perjured himself, using fake news to legitimize a conspiracy theory.
And this myth wasn't just some historical footnote, it was incredibly dangerous. Because in the eyes of the German right, the blame for the surrender and the horrific terms of the subsequent Treaty of Versailles was carried over directly to the Weimar Republic itself.
The Republic was born with the original sin of surrender.
Exactly. This myth deliberately crippled the new democracy from its very inception. It caused massive political instability, justified the assassination of politicians like Matthias Erzberger,
Who was murdered by right-wing extremists in 1921, specifically for signing the Armistice.
and directly fueled the grievances that led to the rise of the Nazi Party and the Third Reich. The seeds of the Second World War were planted in the muddy, unresolved soil of the 1918 Armistice.
Which brings us to our final section, Legacy and Echoes in History.
Because history, unfortunately, loves a dark rhyme. There is a chilling postscript regarding Marshal Foch's private railway wagon in the Compiègne Forest.
Oh, this is such a dark detail.
Fast forward to the Second World War, June 1940. The German military has just rapidly defeated France. Adolf Hitler, keenly aware of the humiliation of 1918 and a massive proponent of the stab-in-the-back myth, orchestrates a staggering act of historical revenge.
He forces the French delegation to negotiate their surrender inside that exact same railway car.
He had it brought out of a museum.
Yes, Hitler had the car placed on the exact same spot in the Compiègne Forest where Erzberger had been forced to sign in 1918. He sat in the very chair Foch had used. The armistice was explicitly portrayed as erasing the shame of 1918.
And immediately afterward, the glade of the armistice was blown up and destroyed by the Germans, and the train car was eventually taken to Berlin.
It's incredibly petty, but it shows how deeply these events scarred the European psyche. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it shows how deeply the symbolism and the precise timing of 1918 embedded itself into global consciousness.
The numerology alone is powerful.
Right. The numerology of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month became iconic. We see a fascinating example of this echoing across the world decades later.
When was that?
When the Second Sino-Japanese War, which was the Asian theater of World War II, finally came to an end, the formal surrender of Japanese forces in China was signed on September 9th, 1945, at exactly 9 a.m.
That is the 9th hour of the 9th day of the 9th month.
Exactly. This date and time were chosen specifically to echo the 1918 armistice. Additionally, in Chinese culture, the number 9 is a homophone for the word meaning long-lasting, suggesting the hope that this new peace in Asia would endure forever.
It's incredible how humanity clings to these patterns, these neat dates, to try and impose order on the absolute chaos of war, and we still do it today.
We do.
This singular, hurried, desperately flawed event in a cold railway car gave birth to the global traditions of remembrance we still observe. Armistice Day, Veterans Day in the U.S., Remembrance Day across the Commonwealth, even Polish Independence Day, they all stem directly from the ink drying on that paper on November 11th.
Indeed. The legacy of that day is profoundly dual-natured. It is a day of genuine relief and solemn remembrance for the millions of young men who died in the mud. But it is also a permanent historical warning of how the manner in which a war ends, the political machinations, the physical realities on the ground, the myths that are allowed to fester, can directly dictate the peace that followed.
We started by looking at a crumbling German empire, facing a massive Allied pincer movement and the domino-like collapse of its allies, particularly the opening of that southern back door through Bulgaria.
We saw the cynical political chessboard where military leaders like Ludendorff engineered a democratic government just so they could wash their hands of the defeat.
We traveled with Matthias Erzberger on a 10-hour drive through hell to be dictated crushing terms designed to paralyze a nation's infrastructure by Marshal Foch in a secret train car.
We tracked the heartbreaking, totally avoidable deaths of men like Augustin Trebuchet and Henry Gunther in those final, maddening minutes before the 11th hour.
And we watched how the lack of visible defeat in Germany spawned the stab-in-the-back myth, poisoning the Weimar Republic and setting the stage for an even greater catastrophe 2 decades later. It really underscores the value of understanding the incredibly messy human reality that exists just beneath the neat, clean dates we memorize in history class.
It does. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building directly on our discussion of that stab-in-the-back myth.
All right, what is it?
We noted that the physical reality of the war, the fact that the front line was still 450 miles from Berlin and no foreign troops stood on German soil, allowed this devastating lie to flourish. So this raises an important question. How does the physical, visceral visibility of a defeat dictate a nation's psychological ability to accept peace?
That's a good question.
If a population doesn't see the war lost with their own eyes, If their cities aren't occupied, can they ever truly accept the consequences of a surrender treaty? It makes you wonder about General Pershing's terrifying stance.
Marching to Berlin.
Would the 20th century have looked entirely different if Pershing had gotten his way? What if the Allies had refused the armistice, suffered the horrific casualties required, and actually fought their way into the streets of the capital? Would a shattered, occupied Berlin in 1919 have prevented the rise of the Third Reich in 1933? It is a chilling, profound counterfactual to consider.
A truly profound question to end on. Thank you, as always, to our listener for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking past the neat headlines of history, and keep exploring the why behind the facts. Until next time.